What's up, YouTube? Welcome to this next part, I think part 3 of our gRPC series. If you haven't watched the previous 2 parts, I'll put a link in the description below, and you'll also find links at the end of this video, but I do suggest you watch those in case you haven't watched them before this. So the last video was a getting started. This video is going to jump to the other extreme, which is how do you get from getting started to a production quality code base? How do you make that leap? And I want to talk about certain key aspects about it's nothing to do necessarily with gRPC, but just general, let's call it, system design. And from there, then implement a gRPC version of that design. Now, I have a system that is ready. The code for that will be on my GitHub, and the link will be in the description below. Some of you have already seen this code base and downloaded it. It's the MovieService code base. Now, the MovieService code base, as it stands today, surfaces a web API, JSON endpoints. All right. We are going to add to that system the existing ASP.NET application, gRPC. So I want to start from that, adding gRPC to either an existing ASP.NET core application, or if you want to build both simultaneously, how do you go about doing that? And then the focus is really going to be on the fact that there is a system, it's already working, it's already there. The fact that we want to expose a gRPC endpoint to the system is a detail. The system is not built for, didn't even know it was going to be used in a gRPC environment. So I want you to think in those terms when you build a system, even though you might be building the system now, and you intend to use gRPC or you intend to use Web API, it doesn't matter. I'm saying think of that system, whatever that is to you, the system, the black box, as something that should function independently of, and should be agnostic of the means with which you access it. All right, now if you've seen my video on API design, part 1 and 2, I'll put a link to those videos up here. Those are key because it's this video is sort of a follow-on from those videos. But in this video, we're going to see the code that I talk about in those videos. All right. So the gRPC aspect is essentially just a detail for this video. Since I want to use gRPC and I want to implement a gRPC endpoint or some endpoints, remote procedure calls for a pre-existing system. Right. If you don't have a pre-existing system, that's fine. You need to think about your new system as if the system is a black box. It's separate. So I'm going to show you the slide over here and then try and explain myself with the help of these slides. So here is a system. This is what I call the black box. This black box works independently of Web API, MVC, gRPC, console application. It doesn't matter. It's a box. It's a black box. It's a system that fully functions. How you use it, how you display data from it is not this system's responsibility. Therefore, it doesn't even know how you intend to use it. All right. And I'll show you. And if you want an example of that MovieService code that I've put a link to in the description below will show you such a system where the domain facade and all classes that are behind the domain facade are the system. The fact that there's a web API controller or controllers in that project are just implementation details. They don't really have any significance to the system. All right. So here's that black box. And to this black box, we want to add a gRPC capability. So once we have our proto files defined, the tooling will create the orange box, the gRPC service classes, all the related classes to the gRPC service classes, and all the classes related to the gRPC stub, as they call it, the client side. So server side and client side. All right. So with the help of the proto file, we can create this code generate the gRPC service side of the equation or the gRPC client side of the equation. We're going to use the same proto files in both the server side project and the client side project. And we will have the client side project generate the client code, which is this orange box here, and the server side to generate this code. So what you want to get from here is that this code is not where we would necessarily write our own code. I want you to use a different class and write the code in that class. Now, this is the service interface layer. If you've seen my video on the API design, you'll realize that the SIL, or the service interface layer, is a black box. A system can have many service interface layers. This is the layer that allows you to interface with the interface, meaning interact with the service, whether it's web API, whether it's JSON, XML, gRPC, console application, Windows Forms application. It doesn't matter. The system, black box, is there. How you interface with it, there could be one way, there could be many ways. The system is independent or agnostic of the SILs, and the SILs have to work with what the system has to offer. In this particular case, we want to use gRPC as the means to interact with our system. The code that is generated or auto-generated for us using the proto files is a stepping stone. It is not the code that you should write. And if you do write the code, I want you to understand where does that code place itself in the system, all right? And so this slide is showing that the code that the proto files generate for us, the tooling generates for us, gRPC tooling generates for us, is this orange box. And the class that we will descend from the, what they call the base class here, will be considered, as should be considered, part of a service interface layer. It's synonymous or similar to the web API controller. So it plays that position. So if you haven't seen my video on roles and responsibilities of a controller, please do that. I'll put a link to that here as well. That video will explain the roles and responsibilities of a controller. It's the same for the gRPC code that you're gonna write, which is part of the service interface layer. All right. I want to keep the code that is gRPC centric, separate, decoupled from the system. The system should not know about the gRPC side, and the gRPC side on the service end of the equation will have to do what it needs to do to map, convert whatever the black box's data inputs and outputs to what it needs and what it needs to do. All right. So that's what I'm showing over here. The black box is working with a type called movie, another type called genre, and we'll see all of these. And there are, I just call it exception, but there's a bunch of custom exceptions, lots of custom exceptions that this system is throwing. All right. The gRPC side has a movie, but it's a different kind of movie. And so we're going to call that, alias it to movie resource. And then it has to map the movie from the business side of the equation to a movie resource. It has to map the genre from the business side of the equation to what we are calling gRPC genre. And all custom exceptions need to be then mapped to somehow an RPC exception. All right. That responsibility will be akin to the responsibilities of roles and responsibilities of a controller, a web API controller. In this case, it becomes the responsibility of the gRPC class that we are going to be building on our server side of the application that has to do the mapping. Right? So it's a two-way mapping, if you will, because you can get movies coming from the client side, and it's going to have to convert the movie resource back to a movie. All right, so we'll talk about that. So on the one end, this box here is the service interface layer, but we'll have, this is a layer in that it's a conceptual thing. It's not a physical thing. So in that layer, we're going to have a class, and that class is going to have to implement the functionality I talked about. It's going to have to encapsulate the gRPC things. It's going to have to do the mapping between like our movie and the movie resource, and our genre and the genre, our gRPC genre, and our custom exceptions to RPC exceptions, and backwards. So like it's a two-way thing. The knowledge of gRPC doesn't leave that layer, certainly doesn't leave that class. And that's important. The knowledge of the fact that you know you're using gRPC stays is confined to that class. All right. So we'll look at the server-side implementation, and then we'll come back to this slide for the client side. All right. Okay. So let me just show you the code here. We have our solution. There's a domain layer. That's a database project. So this is an assembly project. That's a web API, ASP.NET project. And then that's the client. So we're going to be looking at the web API project along with the domain layer. This is the server side. And then later we look at the client side. All right. So starting with the pre-existing ASP.NET web API, if you look at the startup class here, you'll see that I've added the gRPC option here. This was not there before. So add days of pages and add singleton was there, but add gRPC was not. And in this case, I picked a certain option to allow adding detailed errors as part of the gRPC service. And then in the endpoints scenario, I've added along with the map laser pages and this that was there before. I've simply added an endpoint mapping for gRPC service. And in this case, I picked the class in which I've implemented that service. All right. Let's look at the proto files. So the proto file, in the case of a movie service, we have these three methods on our service. The get all movies, which is returns a movie response, which has a collection of movies as a property. The get all movies streaming, that returns a stream of a movie, single movie, which looks like that. And this movie has a genre, which is actually in a different file. I've intentionally put in a different file here just so you can see how to import your own types from other proto files. So I'm importing from the protos folder /genre/proto, the genre. Okay, you can look at that over here. So that's that. That's the genre. All right. Okay. So these three methods, we'll implement these very quickly today in this video and see how all of that works. So that's the web application piece. All right. Now the service that we've created here, if you look at this class here, this is part of the service interface layer. It is not your black box. All right. It's the service interface layer. The fact that we want to access that black box from a gRPC service is a detail that the black box doesn't need to understand. The system doesn't care how you intend to use it. The system is built agnostic of the fact that we want to use it from gRPC. So if I look at this system here, this class descends from our movie service base class. This is the code generated class. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to look at the video, getting started video I made prior to this one, because that explains all of these classes that are code gen for us. So I'm not going to go through that whole process again and just assume that you know that this class is the base class that was generated by the code generation. All right. And we are implementing our own class as a descendant from that. So in this class, we have access to our domain facade. This is this system. The domain facade is this system, meaning everything you can do in the system is available to you through this domain facade. How it does it, who does it within that system, don't care, right? So that facade is that facade says, okay, I'll surface all the features the system will provide. Who within that system needs to be doing it or is doing it, or what the sequence of the calls are, doesn't matter. You don't want to know on the outside. That's the domain facade. And we look at the public surface of this class, so you get a sense of what it can do. And here we have a implementation of we're overriding here, implementation of the get all movies. This signature is of course defined by the proto file. It returns a movie response and it gets these pieces of information. Empty is really how we defined it. We don't need anything to get all movies. The domain facade call get all movies without any arguments returns a collection of movies. These are movies that are domain movies. Remember, there's two movies. One type is part of the domain layer. The other type is part of the gRPC side of things. And we don't want the gRPC side of things encroaching into the system side of things and vice versa. Right? So this class's responsibility becomes the mapping. The domain layer gives it a domain movie, which we call movie within the code base here. And the gRPC side also calls it movie, but we alias it. I'll show you that. We alias it here. So the gRPC movie is alias to something we call movie resource, while the domain layer movie is alias to be called movie. All right. Similarly, the domain layer's genre is called alias to be genre, and the gRPC genre is alias to be gRPC genre. All right. This class is the class that we are interested in on the service side of the equation, where we encapsulate the gRPC side of things. It's synonymous to a controller, a web API controller in that sense. So it's got all the same responsibilities, roles and responsibilities. It's the class that's plugged into the ASP.NET pipeline. So the ASP.NET pipeline knows that this class is to be exposed as a gRPC endpoint. All right. All right. And then, so we'll go into the details of these implementations. Basically, we are implementing 3 different methods: get all movies. Then we have a streaming version of the get all movies. And then we have the create movie method that creates a movie. Now let's look at this domain facade itself. What does it allow us to do? Or what are the features that this system, this black box has? Let's take a look at the public methods here. Get movie by ID. We aren't exposing this, but as you can imagine, it should be very simple. Given an ID, get back a movie. Get all movies. This is one of the methods that we are exposing through our gRPC endpoints. It returns an enumerable of movie. In this case, movie, of course, is the domain layer movie. It's not the gRPC version. Get all movies stream is returning an async enumerable. This is the new feature in C#8, which is what they call streaming, but really is a asynchronous enumerable. So async enumerable. Anytime you have a method that returns an async enumerable of some t, that method either is not marked with the async modifier here and does not have an await or does a return, or if you need to do an awaitable call, it needs to be marked with the async modifier, and then at that time has to have an await and also must return using yield return, cannot just return. Right? We look at some of the implementation, get a sense of what I'm saying there. But nonetheless, so that's the method that we have exposed. We haven't exposed this one yet, the get movies by genre. Again, it should be very simple for us to do that. And then there's a create movie, which we have exposed. Okay, so we can create a movie from the client side. Given a movie, it should come in here and get the work done. This black box, the system, is already tested and working. So it's not like we have to build this piece or worry about whether it's going to work or not. As long as we conform to its API, it's just going to work. So if the domain layer is good with what we ask it for, it's going to return what we expected, and that should be fine. Our job is really to implement the gRPC equation of the side of things. All right. So going back to this class, this class is code generated for us by the gRPC tooling. And we have to then descend from this class to create our own version of it here. All right. So this class is really static here. Basically, it's grpc.services.movieservice.base. This is that nested class that is generated as part of this generated class. Okay. So this is a static class. And this class is an instance class nested inside the static class. So we alias that here. This is just called, this is a new feature in I think C#7. We can use a static like this. And then that's that. All right. Now let's look at the implementation. So we call this domain facade. We get all movies here. What we get returned here is the domain layer of the movies collection. We map that to our movie response, which is nothing but if you look at that, let's go here. This is the type that was defined by our code generation that has a property called movies, and we add our movies one by one to this collection. However, we are working here with the collection of movie domain layer movies, while the movie response requires a movie resource, right? So basically that's what it is. It takes a movie, it maps it to a movie resource. This is a different type. This is the gRPC version of the movie. That's the domain layer. So it's just a bunch of mapping. But what's key here is to understand that the mapping is the responsibility of this service interface layer. Now, whether this class does it directly or it enlists the help of another class that does the mapping is not really the question. It's happening within the confines of, or within the purview of the gRPC service interface layer that we're building. Right? It remains in this layer. It's not the responsibility of the domain layer to do this mapping. Okay, that's what I'm getting at here. So we don't have to test the implementation, as in we know this is going to work. The question is, does this stuff work here, right? Now the streaming movies, the domain layer is returning a method, as you can see here. It returns a method that returns an IAsync, sorry, has a method that returns an IAsync enumerable of movie. This movie, of course, is the domain layer. And our job then becomes to be able to write to the response movies one by one. And so we just done that. So we await for each here with that IAsync enumerable method. And for every iteration, we write out to the stream the mapped version of a movie. So movie resource, right? Same idea here, except we are streaming this out like we did in the last video on the getting started one. Same thing here, but except the IAsync enumerable pre-exists as an already is part of the system. And we're just going to for each await it here and write it out to the response. All right. Now let's look at the client side of the equation. So the gRPC side works with a movie resource, not a movie, and gRPC genre, not a genre, and so on. When the data is sent across to the client side here, the client side receives a movie resource and it needs to be mapped back to a movie. It receives movies with gRPC genre that need to be mapped to genre. And if there are any exceptions, we need to somehow retranslate them or map them back to our custom exceptions. And exceptions is a slightly different topic. We'll cover it today, but it's could be a bit involved. So I'm going to just mention that here. Just focus on these two first. So on the client side, we would have a class that again uses the code-gen classes, the client side of those things. But we need to wrap those classes, abstract them, decouple them from the system. All right. Now, typically, when you're doing that and you're working with a service, you use a gateway. And if you've not seen my video on the gateway, I'll leave a link to that over here. Please watch that because there are a lot of things I cover in that video. I'm not going to go into the details here. We have a gateway here. I'm going to show you the gateway, but I'm going to explain the details of it. So if you need more details, please look at that video. Here, however, you're seeing that there's a proxy. This is the code generated. They call it a stub in the gRPC world. Unfortunately, I don't know why they call it a stub. It's really a proxy. It's code gen by the proto file. All right. And the gateway is a superset of a proxy if you watch my video. And the superset part, the extra code that's there, has to do one of these things. It has to do the mapping to and fro between, like in this case, movie to movie resource and movie resource to movie. To be able to map the genre to gRPC and back, and all exceptions have to translate backwards, meaning RpcExceptions need to be translated to custom exceptions and so on. It's a key aspect of anything that you do remoting, like this, especially RPCs. All right, so we have a gateway. I'm going to switch over to the code now. All right, so we're on the client side of the application here, and we have our movie gateway. This descends from nothing. It's an iDisposable. I'll explain why that is. And it uses the gRPC channel class, and it uses the MovieService client class. This is the class that was code-gen by the proto file thing, okay? The tooling in the Visual Studio aspect. So the client side of the equation has some code generated. That code generated produces a class called MovieService client. We are using that class. In order to use that class, we need a channel. This gRPC channel is just part of the gRPC tooling, and that's the URI to our server side of the application. All right. So now we have a MovieService client instance. The gRPC channel is disposable, which is why we have to implement iDisposable. And if you look at the iDisposable implementation, you'll find that it disposes of the channel. Now, this gateway is responsibility. There's another video, roles and responsibilities of a gateway, the gateway design pattern. I've told you earlier that there'll be a link up here. Please go take a look at that because that's important. Here, I'm just making the assumption you understand what they are. So you just show you how to implement. Get all movies, returning an empty gets us a movie response. The movie response has a property called movies, which is really the movie resource. It's the gRPC movie, not the domain layer movie. So there's a mapping and essentially returns an enumerable of movie. This movie is our domain layer movie. I've got similar aliasing going on here. So this movie is the domain layers movie, while movie resource is the gRPC side of the movies. And same for the genre, which is the domain layer genre. And gRPC genre is the gRPC side of things, right? Notice that this gateway is surfacing, is public methods are talking in the terms of the business and not in the terms of the gRPC side of things. So again, once you've come outside the gateway, so there's some system that's calling the gateway that in turn does the gRPC that talks to the server side, right? That system doesn't want to know about gRPC or what the protocols are and all the types are, right? So the gateway's responsibility is to decouple all of the gRPC things. Even the fact that it's a service, right? The gateway's responsibility is all of those things. The business side of the system, in this case, the UI, doesn't want to know about gRPC, doesn't care to know about gRPC, doesn't even care to know if there's a service somewhere. Just get me the data and just do this work for me, right? It's just talking in this language of the business, the UI. So the gateway is the one that talks in that language, and the gateway will translate, transpose, map, do what it needs to do to get the work done, in this case, at the gRPC level, right? So in order to get all movies, it simply makes a call out to the client. This client is the gRPC client, so it's really talking in the gRPC language, and it has to convert, in this case, the movies from our gRPC movies to the domain layer movies, all right, in the get all movies. In the get all movies stream, again, it's going to use the await for each. So it's getting this method, the read all async that returns an async enumerable. This is part of the tooling. Okay, so we call this method that returns to us a server streaming caller. And this caller has a response stream that has an extension method. All this we did in the last video. And so we iterate over that, and we map the movie resource to a movie and yield return. Of course, we have to yield return in this case because we have to use this asynchronously because we have to await it. Right? So because we have this method marked with the async modifier, then we have to also await it. And at that point, you cannot just return. You have to yield return. That's what that is. Okay. On the business side of the equation, we get an async enumerable. So this is very C#. This is not gRPC at all. This is a new feature in C# 8. And so pretty much any code in C# 8 should be able to understand how to handle an async enumerable of T. All right. That's the other aspect of the gateway is its API inputs, outputs, its public methods, the public surface is talking in the language of the business, not in the language of the gRPC in this case. All right. So that gRPC side has to be kept decoupled from the client side, the UI, let's say. All right. So if you have that, then in our client application, which is at this point is just a console application, and it doesn't actually have any code in it right now. So let me just show you that. Program CS. There. Okay. So we don't have any code here. So the idea would be we should MovieService gateways, you go to new MovieService gateway, all right? And on this MovieService gateway, there should be a method that gets us get all movies. And this get all movies, if you look here, it takes it returns enumerable movies, right? Right. And then there's get all movie streaming or stream, which returns an async enumerable of movie. Okay. So let's implement that. Okay. And then let me also just implement this print movies method. All right. So we get all movies. See, this is the sort of the client-side application. So you don't want to know that there's a gRPC thing. That's to be the idea of the gateway is to give you that abstraction to decouple you from implementation details on the client side here. The fact that you're using gRPC, that you're making a remote call, don't want to know all of that, that you don't want all that impacting your client application in this case. Let's say it's a console application. On the server side, the service, the controller, if you will, the service interface layer is trying to do the same thing, but from the perspective of the server side, all right? Let's run this application and see how this works. So it's calling the get movies. You're gonna have the browser opening up here. So it's because it's also supporting the web API aspect as well. So I've not disconnected that or disabled that. So that's also working. It's gonna get the data here in a minute. Get it all kicked up and started. Okay, there it is. That's the data. And you see the same data on the gRPC side. Because that's the data, get all movies, if you will. That's what happened. Okay, get all movies. These are all the movies there. All right, so that's working. The client is working. Now let's worry about the next method. So the next method was, what is the option here? We have get all movies stream, right? Okay, so let's do that. Let's implement that method here. Okay. So get all movies stream that returns an async enumerable. Remember, this is not gRPC anymore. From the gateway, we are getting actually C# things. And so we should be able to just simply print those movies. And these are domain layer movies, not movie resource, if you will. Print those movies out. So let's implement that method. There you go. So given an async enumerable of movie, simply await for each it, and for every movie, print it out. Cool. All right. 2 methods have been implemented, and the code will be available for you in my GitHub. There'll be a link in the description below. I'm rushing this because I don't think you need to watch all the code being written. I'm hoping you just understand what I'm trying to show you here, and then when you look at the code, maybe it'll all make sense. Or you download the code and watch this video, and you kind of track along with what I'm saying in this video so you can understand what I'm trying to explain here. Okay, so now we've got these 2 methods implemented. Let's look at the streaming side, and that should be fun. Because the streaming side is going to be endless, just the way it was implemented on the server side. Let's see here. Yeah, see, it's never going to stop. It's going too fast, it's never going to stop. So let's slow it down a little bit. And also that'll explain to you the big benefit and the beauty of streaming. Because this may not make any sense to you if you don't understand what streaming really is. The C#8 streaming, what it is. I'll hopefully demonstrate that to you here. Let me make some modifications. Remember, the server side is an implementation of this domain layer, and this domain layer has a data layer that has a data manager that does the implementation of that actual thing. So this data is actually coming from a database here, and that's going to be called get movies stream. Let me find that video. Get all movies is here. Yeah, get all movies stream. You see this method, this data layer method itself is returning an async enumerable of movie. This is all domain layer stuff. So this code is already implemented. This is the black box that I spoke of earlier. So I don't want you to get all kind of confused about this code. It's all available to you to see, but that's not really what I want to show you. But this method is implemented as a streaming method. And for those of you interested, the data reader in ASP.NET, AD.NET, is a streaming data reader. It has always been a streaming data reader. It's not like it's something new. It was always a streaming data reader. And so what I'm doing here is I'm using the data reader streaming ability to implement a method that is also streaming. So what's really happening is, as I'm reading records from the data reader, I am yield returning them out as I receive the data. All right, so this is happening literally from the database. One record arrives from the database through the data reader. I yield return that out as a movie reaches the client, and it's doing that. It's not waiting for all the movies to arrive before it returns it. So that's the big benefit or difference between streaming. All right. So now here, what I'm going to do is let me try and, should I just delay it here? So if I delay it, let's say this thing takes a long time to get the data, right? One record at a time. Okay, so I delayed by a second here. Oops, need to await it. All right, let's see what happens to the output. So this is on the client. This is the client side. Oops. There you go. The client is receiving the data, but it's receiving data one record at a time with an interval of 1 second. Of course, that 1 second is just a hacked thing. It's not like it's going to take 1 second. The idea is that as the data comes from the database, in this case, it will be sent out to the client immediately, 1 record at a time. So the client is not waiting for 1 million records to accumulate before it starts to see the data. That's the whole point of streaming. Anyway, so we've got the get all movies and the get all movies streaming version implemented. And now we'll look at the create movie part. Now, I'm going to blow past the creating part itself, but I wanted to talk about the exception part. All right. So rather than belaboring this whole thing, it's not anything fancy. The differences I'll give you the highlights of this create method. On the client side, you get a business movie and business domain layer genre. It goes to the gateway on the client side. The gateway has to translate that movie to a movie resource, which is what the gRPC side requires, and the genre to a gRPC genre, which is what it requires. That movie goes across the wire, reaches the server side, as all gRPC things. That side will have to convert the movie resource back to a movie, domain layer movie, and the gRPC genre back to a genre, and then call the domain for start saying, hey, create a movie, right? Now, that's great if it works. Now, what if there's an exception? The exception comes from the domain layer. The domain layer doesn't understand gRPC, it doesn't want to know and get all caught up in this gRPC side. And that's what I'm sort of getting at here. What to do and how to do it, where to do it. It comes to exceptions. First of all, let's talk about gRPC exceptions. In my opinion, gRPC exceptions are not fleshed out. There's a long way to go with regards to this idea of exceptions in the gRPC world. What is there today is not going to cut the mustard. It will sort of suffice, but that's not how you want to be in the future. I mean, HTTP in many ways is a little more mature, if you will, than the gRPC side. SOAP definitely was much more mature with the SOAP walls. Things are in flux on this side, on the gRPC exceptions aspect of things. Nonetheless, I'm going to show you what you should do and can do today. And then hopefully as things change in the future, it's a matter of reworking the code, but the idea is still the same. All right. So at a high level, when you're working with remote procedure calls, this is what you would like to see. All right. A client, let's say you're the server, I'm the client. When the server side has an exception, let's say it's called XYZ exception, whatever your exception type is, XYZ exception, then by name, not by the exact compiled type, but the name XYZ exception. I would like to see that exception on my end. So even though you're in the US and I'm in Timbuktu, doesn't matter. I want to see an exception of type XYZ exception. It may not be the same type in the sense of the compiled types, but the name is the same. All right. It's not okay to not get that information across the wire. Typically in remote procedure calls, that's what you expect. So I'm going to show you how to get that, right? With the help of this create movie method, which is, it works, but we're going to intentionally make it fail. And then we'll see what to do. All right. Okay. This thing is still streaming one movie at a time in an endless loop. Better stop that. All right. So the create movie, let's look at the gateway, which is on the client side. So the client side has a method called create movie. It gets a business domain layer movie, which is obviously that's what the gateway will do. And it'll call the gRPC class, generated classes, create movie method, where it has to map the movie to a movie resource. So this domain layer movie has to be mapped to a movie resource and then given to that method. So this goes across the wire. So that mapping occurred from movie to movie resource, from genre to gRPC genre, and it's been sent across the wire here. All right. What comes back is some create movie response that has a property called ID, and you get an ID back. All right, let's not worry about the exception part right now. Okay. On the service side, this is the service side here. We have a method called create movie. In this case, it is I want a movie resource. And I'm going to return to you a create movie response, which is the one that has that ID property. All right. Okay. In order to call the domain layer now, the create movie needs to map the movie resource to a movie. And that's what happens here. So this takes that movie resource and maps it to a domain layer movie and then calls the domain for saying, go create this movie. All right. And if all works fine, the domain layer returns an ID, and you return that. In the case of a response here, you get the ID back. Okay. Again, let's not worry about the exception for now. I'll write the code on the client side to make this work on the happy path. We'll see that happen, and then we'll see the exceptions. Okay. So then back in the client code here, I would like to, and I won't actually, I'll comment out all this stuff because I'm not interested in running these two methods again at this point. All right. And then So I'm going to genre dot, let's say we want to create an action. Okay. Simple code, nothing spectacular here. I'm simply creating a new good, then I'm creating a new movie. This is the domain layer movie. It's got a genre of type action here, got some random data, and I call the gateway is create movie method, giving it this movie instance. That's it. And when I come back with an ID, I print that ID out here. Let's see the happy path working. So should see over here. Oops. There. ID for newly created movie was 1004. Nice. That worked. Happy path worked. All right. So now I know in the system, there's a lot of validation in the server side. There's lots of validations in place. So if I gave an invalid genre, I should get an invalid movie exception. All right. This invalid movie exception is a domain layer exception. I'm just going to switch to the slides here for a bit. This black box throws an exception, custom exception. That exception flies out here. This service interface layer, because it's talking gRPC, has to somehow convert the custom exception to some form of a gRPC thing. In this case, it's called gRPC exception. That exception sort of goes across the wire, if you will, to the client side. Still has a gRPC exception here. The gateway then has to convert or map, transform, translate that gRPC exception back to a custom or one of our custom exceptions. Now, of course, you don't have to share the libraries between these two things. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. I'm just saying that if you want, you can have a common library that, you know, for exceptions that both sides can share, but I don't like to do that necessarily. I want to be able to understand the kind of exception that the server says it has, and I need to be able to hydrate one of those and throw one of those exceptions on my client side. That's all I'm really saying. So how do we convey that data across? And it's pretty cool. We do this in HTTP as well. I'm just going to show you how to do this in gRPC. All right. So let's start on the service side here, where we call the domain facade to create a movie. There could be an exception here. So we try catch this exception. And for every exception that's thrown here, we map it to an RPC exception. Very simple code, but I want to just show this, basically mapping all exceptions, including custom exceptions, to gRPC so that it gets sent across the wire correctly. And then on the other end, on the client side, kind of extract that data and rehydrate an exception, a custom exception on the client side. The mapping is fairly simple. Well, it is simple. Here's it. Basically, it's a bunch of metadata that is being used, and I'm adding some keys here. The reason is part of our exceptions. All our custom exceptions have reasons, so that we just check if it's one of our exceptions. It will have a reason property. Let's add a metadata header or metadata entry for reason with the value of this reason. And then the status, this is all RPC exception based. It's an invalid argument, and the message is the original our custom exception message. I don't want to spend too much time explaining this. It's very self-explanatory, this code. Nothing really weird or fancy. The idea is just that we are using metadata here to augment the RPC exception and embed the message from our custom exception into the RPC exception, and then send that RPC exception across the wire. And then on the other end, kind of reverse the process and rehydrate an exception with the same name, type, and the whole thing. All right. So once we have our exception, we return this. And from the call side, as you can see, there's one place we call it, we throw that exception, right? So we simply catch all exceptions, map it to an RPC exception, and rethrow the exception. All right, that's it. The RPC framework will take care of transmitting that RCP exception on the server side to the client side as an RPC exception. And then we catch that exception and undo what we just did on this end, right? So let's look at our gateway now. So we have a method on that gateway. So this is the client side. Create this movie, we may get an exception. If we do, we catch this time an RPC exception because this is in our gateway. So the gateway is fully aware of our RPC side of things. And we get an exception and we map it back to a domain exception. What do? We sort of reverse the process, right? We look at our header values, the return, the exception type, all this stuff. We look at the status code, and we essentially either throw one of. I've just used exception here. This would be all. We know what kind of exception we should have because we would know the type of exception. I'm only implemented the one invalid movie exception, so just bear with me. It's not a full-on implementation, but it gives you the idea of how to go about implementing this in production. So in the case of an invalid movie exception, we throw a new invalid movie exception with the data in there. And that's how we are able to rehydrate a custom exception on the service end of the equation, with the gRPC side is being used to kind of modulate, if you will. This is very much like radio frequency, FM, AM, where the modulation is the carrier and inside of that is the data. So we're using our gRPC as the modulation to carry the exception across the wire. And then on the other end, on this end, on the client side, we rehydrate that exception and throw the exception. So the client side of the application is not aware of anything gRPC at all. It looked like an invalid movie exception was actually thrown by this thing, whatever it is. It doesn't even know it as a service. It knows it as a gateway, right? It so happens the gateway is making a remote call. So let's see that in action. So to fake it, I got to do this. This is one of the problems with C# enums. They look like they're strongly typed, but essentially you can cast any integral value to the genre. It's going to work. But the server side is going to start validating the genre. It's going to say, what the heck is the genre? I don't know a 999 genre. I know action, I know drama, I know comedy, blah, blah, blah. So we'll see this exception now. All right? So I'm going to run the application. Minimize that browser. Okay, there it is. So we are now on the client side here, and it says it got an exception. What did it get? Let's look at the zoom in a bit. Oh, look at that. We got an invalid. This is on the client side, by the way, but we got an invalid movie exception. Genre 999 is not a valid genre. Valid values are action, comedy, drama, science fiction, thriller, blah, blah, blah. So you see, this looked, that's a full exception. So we effectively used gRPC to literally just package up our exception within the gRPC modulation, the envelope, if you will. Put our exception in there. That envelope brought our exception across, not necessarily an exception, but the data information across the wire that then allowed us to rehydrate that exception on the client side. So that's what I would recommend for now till some of the exception handling pieces are firmed up, not only on the gRPC side of the equation, meaning the foundation, but also on the ASP.NET side. On the ASP.NET side, the middleware is not effective in catching or building an exception handler for the gRPC side. The gRPC tooling, unfortunately, catches the exception and returns a 200 response from an HTTP standpoint. And so that, I think, is the problem, because that's not the best way to work with exceptions or any errors for that matter. So I don't know if that's a gRPC spec or is that just implementation on the .NET side of things. But nonetheless, on the gRPC side, the exception handling is yet a bit raw, it's a bit immature. It needs to mature quite a bit more. All right. Okay. So what have we done today? We have learned how to use build a client and a server. Most of the code you have access to here is all production, both the production ready code. None of it is kind of just throwaway code. So if you want to learn how to implement not just gRPC services, but any kinds of services and clients, then this little application should help you understand how to separate things out and what the class name should be and stuff like that. And of course, we also looked at streaming gRPC calls and handling exceptions from gRPC calls. So I know this has been a fast, rushed video covering a lot of things. I hope you find it interesting and enjoyable though, and informative. If you have, please give me a thumbs up, and I will see you next time.